The Bishop. Chapter 1. The evening service was being celebrated on the eve of Palm Sunday in the old Petrovsky convent. When they began distributing the palm it was close upon 10 o'clock, the candles were burning dimly, the wicks wanted snuffing, it was all in a sort of mist. In the twilight of the church the crowd seemed heaving like the sea, and to Bishop Pyotr, who had been unwell for the last 3 days, it seemed that all the faces, old and young, men's and women's, were alike, that everyone who came up for the palm had the same expression in his eyes. In the mist he could not see the doors, the crowd kept moving and looked as though there were no end to it. The female choir was singing, a nun was reading the prayers for the day. How stifling, how hot it was. How long the service went on. Bishop Pyotr was tired. His breathing was labored and rapid, his throat was parched, his shoulders ached with weariness, his legs were trembling. And it disturbed him unpleasantly when a religious maniac uttered occasional shrieks in the gallery. And then all of a sudden, as though in a dream or delirium, it seemed to the bishop as though his own mother Marya Timofyevna, whom he had not seen for 9 years, or some old woman just like his mother, came up to him out of the crowd, and, after taking a palm branch from him, walked away looking at him all the while good-humoredly with a kind, joyful smile until she was lost in the crowd. And for some reason tears flowed down his face. There was peace in his heart, everything was well, yet he kept gazing fixedly towards the left choir, where the prayers were being read, where in the dusk of evening you could not recognize anyone. And wept. Tears glistened on his face and on his beard. Here someone close at hand was weeping, then someone else farther away, then others and still others, and little by little the church was filled with soft weeping. And a little later, within 5 minutes, the nuns' choir was singing, no one was weeping and everything was as before. Soon the service was over. When the bishop got into his carriage to drive home, the gay, melodious chime of the heavy, costly bells was filling the whole garden in the moonlight. The white walls, the white crosses on the tombs, the white birch trees and black shadows, and the faraway moon in the sky exactly over the convent, seemed now living their own life. Apart and incomprehensible, yet very near to man. It was the beginning of April, and after the warm spring day it turned cool, there was a faint touch of frost, and the breath of spring could be felt in the soft, chilly air. The road from the convent to the town was sandy, the horses had to go at a walking pace, and on both sides of the carriage in the brilliant, peaceful moonlight there were people trudging along home from church through the sand. And all was silent, sunk in thought, everything around seemed kindly, youthful, akin, everything, trees and sky and even the moon, and one longed to think that so it would be always. At last the carriage drove into the town and rumbled along the principal street. The shops were already shut, but at Erakin's, the millionaire shopkeepers, they were trying the new electric lights, which flickered brightly, and a crowd of people were gathered round. Then came wide, dark, deserted streets, one after another, then the high road, the open country, the fragrance of pines. And suddenly there rose up before the bishop's eyes a white turreted wall, and behind it a tall belfry in the full moonlight, and beside it 5 shining golden cupolas. This was the Pankrativsky monastery, in which Bishop Pyotr lived. And here, too, high above the monastery, was the silent, dreamy moon. The carriage drove in at the gate, crunching over the sand. Here and there in the moonlight there were glimpses of dark monastic figures, and there was the sound of footsteps on the flagstones. "You know, Your Holiness, your mamma arrived while you were away," the lay brother informed the bishop as he went into his cell. "My mother? When did she come?" "Before the evening service. She asked first where you were and then she went to the convent. Then it was her I saw in the church, just now." "Oh, Lord!" And the bishop laughed with joy. "She bade me tell your holiness," the lay brother went on, "that she would come tomorrow. She had a little girl with her, her grandchild, I suppose. They are staying at Ovsianikov's inn." "What time is it now?" "A little after 11. "Oh, how vexing." The bishop sat for a little while in the parlor, hesitating, and as it were refusing to believe it was so late. His arms and legs were stiff, his head ached. He was hot and uncomfortable. After resting a little he went into his bedroom, and there, too, he sat a little, still thinking of his mother. He could hear the lay brother going away, and Father Sisoi coughing the other side of the wall. The monastery clock struck 1:15. The bishop changed his clothes and began reading the prayers before sleep. He read attentively those old, long familiar prayers, and at the same time thought about his mother. She had 9 children and about 40 grandchildren. At one time, she had lived with her husband, the deacon, in a poor village. She had lived there a very long time, from the age of 17 to 60. The bishop remembered her from early childhood, almost from the age of 3, and how he had loved her. Sweet, precious childhood, always fondly remembered. Why did it, that long past time that could never return, why did it seem brighter, fuller, and more festive than it had really been? When in his childhood or youth he had been ill, how tender and sympathetic his mother had been. And now his prayers mingled with the memories, which gleamed more and more brightly like a flame, and the prayers did not hinder his thinking of his mother. When he had finished his prayers he undressed and lay down, and at once, as soon as it was dark, there rose before his mind his dead father, his mother. His native village Lysopoli, the creak of wheels, the bleat of sheep, the church bells on bright summer mornings, the gypsies under the window, oh, how sweet to think of it. He remembered the priest of Lysopoli, Father Simeon, mild, gentle, kindly. He was a lean little man, while his son, a divinity student, was a huge fellow and talked in a roaring bass voice. The priest's son had flown into a rage with the cook and abused her. "Ah, you jihad's ass." And Father Simeon, overhearing it, said not a word, and was only ashamed because he could not remember where such an ass was mentioned in the Bible. After him the priest at Lysopoli had been Father Demian, who used to drink heavily, and at times drank till he saw green snakes, and was even nicknamed Demian Snakeseer. The schoolmaster at Lysopoli was Matvei Nikolaich, who had been a divinity student, a kind and intelligent man, but he, too, was a drunkard. He never beat the schoolchildren, but for some reason he always had hanging on his wall a bunch of birch twigs. And below it an utterly meaningless inscription in Latin, Betula Kinderbalsamica Secuta. He had a shaggy black dog whom he called Syntax. And His Holiness laughed. 6 miles from Lysopoli was the village of Nino with a wonder-working icon. In the summer they used to carry the icon in procession about the neighboring villages and ring the bells the whole day long. First in one village and then in another, and it used to seem to the bishop then that joy was quivering in the air, and he, in those days his name was Pavlusha, used to follow the icon. Bareheaded and barefoot, with naive faith, with a naive smile, infinitely happy. In Obnino, he remembered now, there were always a lot of people, and the priest there, Father Alexei, to save time during Mass, used to make his deaf nephew Ilarion read the names of those for whose health or whose soul's peace prayers were asked. Ilarion used to read them, now and then getting a 5 or 10 kopeck piece for the service, and only when he was grey and bald, when life was nearly over. He suddenly saw written on one of the pieces of paper, "What a fool you are, Ilarion." Up to 15 at least Pavlusha was undeveloped and idle at his lessons, so much so that they thought of taking him away from the clerical school and putting him into a shop. One day, going to the post at Obnino for letters, he had stared a long time at the post office clerks and asked, "Allow me to ask, how do you get your salary, every month or every day?" His Holiness crossed himself and turned over on the other side, trying to stop thinking and go to sleep. "My mother has come," he remembered and laughed. The moon peeped in at the window, the floor was lighted up, and there were shadows on it. A cricket was chirping. Through the wall Father Sisoi was snoring in the next room, and his aged snore had a sound that suggested loneliness, forlornness, even vagrancy. Sisoi had once been housekeeper to the bishop of the diocese, and was called now, the former Father Housekeeper. He was 70 years old, he lived in a monastery 12 miles from the town and stayed sometimes in the town, too. He had come to the Pankrativsky monastery 3 days before, and the bishop had kept him that he might talk to him at his leisure about matters of business, about the arrangements here. At 1:30 they began ringing for matins. Father Sysoy could be heard coughing, muttering something in a discontented voice, then he got up and walked barefoot about the rooms. "Father Sysoy," the bishop called. Sysoy went back to his room and a little later made his appearance in his boots, with a candle. He had on his cassock over his underclothes and on his head was an old faded skullcap. "I can't sleep," said the bishop, sitting up. "I must be unwell. And what it is I don't know. Fever. You must have caught cold, your holiness. You must be rubbed with tallow." Sysoy stood a little and yawned. "Oh Lord, forgive me, a sinner. They had the electric lights on at Erikin's today," he said. "I don't like it." Father Sysoy was old, lean, bent, always dissatisfied with something, and his eyes were angry-looking and prominent as a crab's. "I don't like it," he said, going away. "I don't like it. Bother it." Chapter 2. Next day, Palm Sunday, the bishop took the service in the cathedral in the town, then he visited the bishop of the diocese, then visited a very sick old lady, the widow of a general. And at last drove home. Between 1 and 2 o'clock he had welcome visitors dining with him, his mother and his niece Katya, a child of 8 years old. All dinner-time the spring sunshine was streaming in at the windows, throwing bright light on the white tablecloth and on Katya's red hair. Through the double windows they could hear the noise of the rooks and the notes of the starlings in the garden. "It is 9 years since we have met," said the old lady. "And when I looked at you in the monastery yesterday, good Lord! You've not changed a bit, except maybe you are thinner and your beard is a little longer. Holy Mother, Queen of Heaven! Yesterday at the evening service no one could help crying. I, too, as I looked at you, suddenly began crying, though I couldn't say why. His holy will." And in spite of the affectionate tone in which she said this, he could see she was constrained as though she were uncertain whether to address him formally or familiarly, to laugh or not. And that she felt herself more a deacon's widow than his mother. And Katya gazed without blinking at her uncle, His Holiness, as though trying to discover what sort of a person he was. Her hair sprang up from under the comb and the velvet ribbon and stood out like a halo, she had a turned-up nose and sly eyes. The child had broken a glass before sitting down to dinner, and now her grandmother, as she talked, moved away from Katya first a wineglass and then a tumbler. The bishop listened to his mother and remembered how many years ago she used to take him and his brothers and sisters to relations whom she considered rich. In those days she was taken up with the care of her children, now with her grandchildren, and she had brought Katya. "Your sister, Varenka, has 4 children, she told him. Katya, here, is the eldest. And your brother-in-law Father Ivan fell sick, God knows of what, and died 3 days before the Assumption, and my poor Varenka is left a beggar." "And how is Nicanor getting on?" the bishop asked about his eldest brother. "He is all right, thank God. Though he has nothing much, yet he can live. Only there is one thing, his son, my grandson Nikolasha, did not want to go into the church, he has gone to the university to be a doctor. He thinks it is better, but who knows? His holy will. Nikolasha cuts up dead people," said Katya, spilling water over her knees. "Sit still, child," her grandmother observed calmly, and took the glass out of her hand. "Say a prayer, and go on eating. How long it is since we have seen each other," said the bishop, and he tenderly stroked his mother's hand and shoulder. "And I missed you abroad, mother, I missed you dreadfully." "Thank you. I used to sit in the evenings at the open window, lonely and alone. Often there was music playing, and all at once I used to be overcome with homesickness and felt as though I would give everything only to be at home and see you." His mother smiled, beamed, but at once she made a grave face and said, "Thank you." His mood suddenly changed. He looked at his mother and could not understand how she had come by that respectfulness, that timid expression of face. What was it for? And he did not recognize her. He felt sad and vexed. And then his head ached just as it had the day before, his legs felt fearfully tired, and the fish seemed to him stale and tasteless. He felt thirsty all the time. After dinner 2 rich ladies, landowners, arrived and sat for an hour and a half in silence with rigid countenances. The archimandrite, a silent, rather deaf man, came to see him about business. Then they began ringing for vespers. The sun was setting behind the wood and the day was over. When he returned from church, he hurriedly said his prayers, got into bed, and wrapped himself up as warm as possible. It was disagreeable to remember the fish he had eaten at dinner. The moonlight worried him, and then he heard talking. In an adjoining room, probably in the parlor, Father Saisoy was talking politics. There's war among the Japanese now. They are fighting. The Japanese, my good soul, are the same as the Montenegrins, they are the same race. They were under the Turkish yoke together. And then he heard the voice of Marya Timofyevna. So, having said our prayers and drunk tea, we went, you know, to Father Jaeger at Novokatnoy, so. And she kept on saying. Having had tea, or having drunk tea, and it seemed as though the only thing she had done in her life was to drink tea. The bishop slowly, languidly, recalled the seminary, the academy. For 3 years he had been Greek teacher in the seminary. By that time he could not read without spectacles. Then he had become a monk, he had been made a school inspector. Then he had defended his thesis for his degree. When he was 32 he had been made rector of the seminary, and consecrated archimandrite, and then his life had been so easy, so pleasant, it seemed so long, no end was in sight. Then he had begun to be ill, had grown very thin and almost blind, and by the advice of the doctors had to give up everything and go abroad. And what then? Asked Saisoy in the next room. Then we drank tea, answered Marya Timofyevna. Good gracious, you've got a green beard, said Katya suddenly in surprise, and she laughed. The bishop remembered that the grey-headed Father Saisoy's beard really had a shade of green in it, and he laughed. God have mercy upon us, what we have to put up with this girl, said Saisoy, aloud, getting angry. Spoilt child. Sit quiet. The bishop remembered the perfectly new white church in which he had conducted the services while living abroad. He remembered the sound of the warm sea. In his flat he had 5 lofty light rooms. In his study he had a new writing table, lots of books. He had read a great deal and often written. And he remembered how he had pined for his native land, how a blind beggar woman had played the guitar under his window every day and sung of love, and how, as he listened, he had always for some reason thought of the past. But 8 years had passed and he had been called back to Russia, and now he was a suffragan bishop, and all the past had retreated far away into the mist as though it were a dream. Father Saisoy came into the bedroom with a candle. I say, he said, wondering, are you asleep already, Your Holiness? What is it? Why, it's still early, 10 o'clock or less. I bought a candle today, I wanted to rub you with tallow. I am in a fever, said the bishop, and he sat up. I really ought to have something. My head is bad. Saisoy took off the bishop's shirt and began rubbing his chest and back with tallow. That's the way, he said. Lord Jesus Christ, that's the way. I walked to the town today, I was at what's his name's, the chief priest Sidonsky's. I had tea with him. I don't like him. Lord Jesus Christ. That's the way. I don't like him. Chapter 3. The bishop of the diocese, a very fat old man, was ill with rheumatism or gout, and had been in bed for over a month. Bishop Pyotr went to see him almost every day, and saw all who came to ask his help. And now that he was unwell he was struck by the emptiness, the triviality of everything which they asked and for which they wept. he was vexed at their ignorance, their timidity. And all this useless, petty business oppressed him by the mass of it, and it seemed to him that now he understood the diocesan bishop, who had once in his young days written on the doctrines of the freedom of the will, and now seemed to be all lost in trivialities, to have forgotten everything, and to have no thoughts of religion. The bishop must have lost touch with Russian life while he was abroad. He did not find it easy. The peasants seemed to him coarse, the women who sought his help dull and stupid, the seminarists and their teachers uncultivated and at times savage. And the documents coming in and going out were reckoned by tens of thousands, and what documents they were! The higher clergy in the whole diocese gave the priests, young and old, and even their wives and children, marks for their behavior, a 5, a 4, and sometimes even a 3. And about this he had to talk and to read and write serious reports. And there was positively not 1 minute to spare. His soul was troubled all day long, and the bishop was only at peace when he was in church. He could not get used, either, to the awe which, through no wish of his own, he inspired in people in spite of his quiet, modest disposition. All the people in the province seemed to him little, scared, and guilty when he looked at them. Everyone was timid in his presence, even the old chief priests. Everyone flopped at his feet, and not long previously an old lady, a village priest's wife who had come to consult him, was so overcome by awe that she could not utter a single word, and went empty away. And he, who could never in his sermons bring himself to speak ill of people, never reproached anyone because he was so sorry for them, was moved to fury with the people who came to consult him, lost his temper and flung their petitions on the floor. The whole time he had been here, not one person had spoken to him genuinely, simply, as to a human being. Even his old mother seemed now not the same. And why, he wondered, did she chatter away to Sysoy and laugh so much, while with him, her son, she was grave and usually silent and constrained, which did not suit her at all. The only person who behaved freely with him and said what he meant was old Sysoy, who had spent his whole life in the presence of bishops and had outlived 11 of them. And so the bishop was at ease with him, although, of course, he was a tedious and nonsensical man. After the service on Tuesday, His Holiness Pyotr was in the diocesan bishop's house receiving petitions there. He got excited and angry, and then drove home. He was as unwell as before. He longed to be in bed, but he had hardly reached home when he was informed that a young merchant called Erakin, who subscribed liberally to charities, had come to see him about a very important matter. The bishop had to see him. Erakin stayed about an hour, talked very loud, almost shouted, and it was difficult to understand what he said. God grant it may, he said as he went away. Most essential. According to circumstances, Your Holiness. I trust it may. After him came the Mother Superior from a distant convent. And when she had gone they began ringing for vespers. He had to go to church. In the evening the monks sang harmoniously, with inspiration. A young priest with a black beard conducted the service. And the bishop, hearing of the bridegroom who comes at midnight and of the heavenly mansion adorned for the festival, felt no repentance for his sins, no tribulation, but peace at heart and tranquility. And he was carried back in thought to the distant past, to his childhood and youth, when, too, they used to sing of the bridegroom and of the heavenly mansion. And now that past rose up before him, living, fair, and joyful as in all likelihood it never had been. And perhaps in the other world, in the life to come, we shall think of the distant past, of our life here, with the same feeling. Who knows? The bishop was sitting near the altar. It was dark. Tears flowed down his face. He thought that here he had attained everything a man in his position could attain. He had faith and yet everything was not clear, something was lacking still. He did not want to die, and he still felt that he had missed what was most important, something of which he had dimly dreamed in the past. And he was troubled by the same hopes for the future as he had felt in childhood, at the academy and abroad. How well they sing today, he thought, listening to the singing. How nice it is. Chapter 4. On Thursday he celebrated Mass in the cathedral. It was the washing of feet. When the service was over and the people were going home, it was sunny, warm. The water gurgled in the gutters, and the unceasing trilling of the larks, tender, telling of peace, rose from the fields outside the town. The trees were already awakening and smiling a welcome, while above them the infinite, fathomless blue sky stretched into the distance, God knows whither. On reaching home His Holiness drank some tea, then changed his clothes, lay down on his bed, and told the lay brother to close the shutters on the windows. The bedroom was darkened. But what weariness, what pain in his legs and his back, a chill heavy pain, what a noise in his ears. He had not slept for a long time, for a very long time, as it seemed to him now, and some trifling detail which haunted his brain as soon as his eyes were closed prevented him from sleeping. As on the day before, sounds reached him from the adjoining rooms through the walls, voices, the jingle of glasses and teaspoons. Marya Timofyevna was gaily telling Father Sysoy some story with quaint turns of speech, while the latter answered in a grumpy, ill-humored voice, "Bother them. Not likely. What next?" And the bishop again felt vexed and then hurt that with other people his old mother behaved in a simple, ordinary way, while with him, her son, she was shy, spoke little, and did not say what she meant, and even, as he fancied, had during all those 3 days kept trying in his presence to find an excuse for standing up. Because she was embarrassed at sitting before him. And his father? He, too, probably, if he had been living, would not have been able to utter a word in the bishop's presence. Something fell down on the floor in the adjoining room and was broken. Katya must have dropped a cup or a saucer, for Father Sysoy suddenly spat and said angrily, "What a regular nuisance the child is. Lord forgive my transgressions. One can't provide enough for her." Then all was quiet, the only sounds came from outside. And when the bishop opened his eyes he saw Katya in his room, standing motionless, staring at him. Her red hair, as usual, stood up from under the comb like a halo. "Is that you, Katya?" he asked. "Who is it downstairs who keeps opening and shutting a door?" "I don't hear it," answered Katya. And she listened. "There, someone has just passed by." "But that was a noise in your stomach, uncle." He laughed and stroked her on the head. "So you say cousin Nikolasha cuts up dead people?" he asked after a pause. "Yes, he is studying." "And is he kind?" "Oh, yes, he's kind. But he drinks vodka awfully." "And what was it your father died of?" "Papa was weak and very, very thin, and all at once his throat was bad. I was ill then, too, and brother Fedya, we all had bad throats. Papa died, uncle, and we got well." Her chin began quivering, and tears gleamed in her eyes and trickled down her cheeks. "Your Holiness," she said in a shrill voice, by now weeping bitterly, "uncle, mother and all of us are left very wretched. Give us a little money, do be kind, uncle darling." He, too, was moved to tears, and for a long time was too much touched to speak. Then he stroked her on the head, patted her on the shoulder and said, very good, my child. When the Holy Easter comes, we will talk it over. I will help you. I will help you." His mother came in quietly, timidly, and prayed before the icon. Noticing that he was not sleeping, she said, "Won't you have a drop of soup?" "No, thank you," he answered, "I am not hungry." "You seem to be unwell, now I look at you." "I should think so. You may well be ill. The whole day on your legs, the whole day. And, my goodness, it makes one's heart ache even to look at you. Well, Easter is not far off, you will rest then, please God. Then we will have a talk, too, but now I'm not going to disturb you with my chatter. Come along, Katya, let His Holiness sleep a little." And he remembered how once very long ago, when he was a boy, she had spoken exactly like that, in the same jestingly respectful tone, with a church dignitary. Only from her extraordinarily kind eyes and the timid, anxious glance she stole at him as she went out of the room could one have guessed that this was his mother. He shut his eyes and seemed to sleep, but twice heard the clock strike and Father Sisoi coughing the other side of the wall. And once more his mother came in and looked timidly at him for a minute. Someone drove up to the steps, as he could hear, in a coach or in a chaise. Suddenly a knock, the door slammed, the lay brother came into the bedroom. "Your Holiness," he called. "Well? The horses are here, it's time for the evening service." "What o'clock is it?" 7:15. He dressed and drove to the cathedral. During all the 12 Gospels, he had to stand in the middle of the church without moving, and the first Gospel, the longest and the most beautiful, he read himself. A mood of confidence and courage came over him. That first Gospel, "Now is the Son of Man glorified," he knew by heart. And as he read he raised his eyes from time to time, and saw on both sides a perfect sea of lights and heard the splutter of candles, but, as in past years, he could not see the people. And it seemed as though these were all the same people as had been round him in those days, in his childhood and his youth. That they would always be the same every year until such time as God only knew. His father had been a deacon, his grandfather a priest, his great-grandfather a deacon, and his whole family, perhaps from the days when Christianity had been accepted in Russia, had belonged to the priesthood. And his love for the church services, for the priesthood, for the peal of the bells, was deep in him, ineradicable, innate. In church, particularly when he took part in the service, he felt vigorous, of good cheer, happy. So it was now. Only when the 8th Gospel had been read, he felt that his voice had grown weak, even his cough was inaudible. His head had begun to ache intensely, and he was troubled by a fear that he might fall down. And his legs were indeed quite numb, so that by degrees he ceased to feel them and could not understand how or on what he was standing, and why he did not fall. It was 11:45 when the service was over. When he reached home, the bishop undressed and went to bed at once without even saying his prayers. He could not speak and felt that he could not have stood up. When he had covered his head with the quilt he felt a sudden longing to be abroad, an insufferable longing. He felt that he would give his life not to see those pitiful cheap shutters, those low ceilings, not to smell that heavy monastery smell. If only there were one person to whom he could have talked, have opened his heart. For a long while he heard footsteps in the next room and could not tell whose they were. At last the door opened, and Sisoi came in with a candle and a teacup in his hand. "You are in bed already, Your Holiness?" he asked. "Here I have come to rub you with spirit and vinegar. A thorough rubbing does a great deal of good. Lord Jesus Christ. That's the way, that's the way. I've just been in our monastery. I don't like it. I'm going away from here tomorrow, Your Holiness, I don't want to stay longer. Lord Jesus Christ. That's the way." Sisoi could never stay long in the same place, and he felt as though he had been a whole year in the Pankrativsky monastery. Above all, listening to him it was difficult to understand where his home was, whether he cared for anyone or anything, whether he believed in God. He did not know himself why he was a monk, and, indeed, he did not think about it, and the time when he had become a monk had long passed out of his memory. It seemed as though he had been born a monk. "I'm going away tomorrow, God be with them all. I should like to talk to you." "I can't find the time," said the bishop softly with an effort. "I don't know anything or anybody here. I'll stay till Sunday if you like, so be it, but I don't want to stay longer. I am sick of them." "I ought not to be a bishop," said the bishop softly. "I ought to have been a village priest, a deacon, or simply a monk. All this oppresses me, oppresses me." "What? Lord Jesus Christ. That's the way. Come, sleep well, Your Holiness. What's the good of talking? It's no use. Good night." The bishop did not sleep all night. And at 8 o'clock in the morning he began to have hemorrhage from the bowels. The lay brother was alarmed, and ran first to the archimandrite, then for the monastery doctor, Ivan Andreyitch, who lived in the town. The doctor, a stout old man with a long grey beard, made a prolonged examination of the bishop, and kept shaking his head and frowning, then said, "Do you know, your holiness, you have got typhoid?" After an hour or so of hemorrhage the bishop looked much thinner, paler, and wasted. His face looked wrinkled, his eyes looked bigger, and he seemed older, shorter, and it seemed to him that he was thinner, weaker, more insignificant than anyone. That everything that had been had retreated far, far away, and would never go on again or be repeated. How good, he thought, how good. His old mother came. Seeing his wrinkled face and his big eyes, she was frightened. She fell on her knees by the bed and began kissing his face, his shoulders, his hands. And to her, too, it seemed that he was thinner, weaker, and more insignificant than anyone, and now she forgot that he was a bishop. And kissed him as though he were a child very near and very dear to her. "Pavlusha, darling," she said, "my own, my darling son. Why are you like this? Pavlusha, answer me." Katya, pale and severe, stood beside her, unable to understand what was the matter with her uncle, why there was such a look of suffering on her grandmother's face. Why she was saying such sad and touching things. By now he could not utter a word, he could understand nothing, and he imagined he was a simple ordinary man, that he was walking quickly, cheerfully through the fields, tapping with his stick. While above him was the open sky bathed in sunshine, and that he was free now as a bird and could go where he liked. "Pavlusha, my darling son, answer me," the old woman was saying. "What is it?" "My own." "Don't disturb his holiness," Sysoy said angrily, walking about the room. "Let him sleep, what's the use, it's no good." 3 doctors arrived, consulted together, and went away again. The day was long, incredibly long, then the night came on and passed slowly, slowly. And towards morning on Saturday the lay brother went in to the old mother who was lying on the sofa in the parlor, and asked her to go into the bedroom. The bishop had just breathed his last. Next day was Easter Sunday. There were 42 churches and 6 monasteries in the town. The sonorous, joyful clang of the bells hung over the town from morning till night unceasingly, setting the spring air a-quiver. The birds were singing, the sun was shining brightly. The big market square was noisy, swings were going, barrel organs were playing, accordions were squeaking, drunken voices were shouting. After midday people began driving up and down the principal street. In short, all was merriment, everything was satisfactory, just as it had been the year before, and as it will be in all likelihood next year. A month later a new suffragan bishop was appointed, and no one thought anything more of Bishop Pyotr, and afterwards he was completely forgotten. And only the dead man's old mother, who is living today with her son-in-law the deacon in a remote little district town. When she goes out at night to bring her cow in and meets other women at the pasture, begins talking of her children and her grandchildren, and says that she had a son a bishop. And this she says timidly, afraid that she may not be believed. And, indeed, there are some who do not believe her. Betrothed. Chapter 1. It was 10 o'clock in the evening and the full moon was shining over the garden. In the Shuman's house an evening service celebrated at the request of the grandmother, Marfa Mihailovna, was just over. And now Nadia, she had gone into the garden for a minute, could see the table being laid for supper in the dining room, and her grandmother bustling about in her gorgeous silk dress. Father Andrei, a chief priest of the cathedral, was talking to Nadia's mother, Nina Ivanovna, and now in the evening light through the window her mother for some reason looked very young. Andrei Andreitch, Father Andrei's son, was standing by listening attentively. It was still and cool in the garden, and dark peaceful shadows lay on the ground. There was a sound of frogs croaking, far, far away beyond the town. There was a feeling of May, sweet May. One drew deep breaths and longed to fancy that not here but far away under the sky, above the trees, far away in the open country, in the fields and the woods, the life of spring was unfolding now. Mysterious, lovely, rich and wholly beyond the understanding of weak, sinful man. And for some reason one wanted to cry. She, Nadia, was already 23. Ever since she was 16 she had been passionately dreaming of marriage, and at last she was engaged to Andrei Andreich, the young man who was standing on the other side of the window. She liked him, the wedding was already fixed for July 7th, and yet there was no joy in her heart. She was sleeping badly, her spirits drooped. She could hear from the open windows of the basement where the kitchen was the hurrying servants, the clatter of knives, the banging of the swing door. There was a smell of roast turkey and pickled cherries, and for some reason it seemed to her that it would be like that all her life, with no change, no end to it. Someone came out of the house and stood on the steps. It was Alexander Timofeich, or, as he was always called, Sasha, who had come from Moscow 10 days before and was staying with them. Years ago a distant relation of the grandmother, a gentleman's widow called Marya Petrovna, a thin, sickly little woman who had sunk into poverty, used to come to the house to ask for assistance. She had a son Sasha. It used for some reason to be said that he had talent as an artist, and when his mother died Nadia's grandmother had, for the salvation of her soul, sent him to the Komissarovsky school in Moscow. 2 years later he went into the school of painting, spent nearly 15 years there, and only just managed to scrape through the leaving examination in the section of architecture. He did not set up as an architect, however, but took a job at a lithographer's. He used to come almost every year, usually very ill, to stay with Nadia's grandmother to rest and recover. He was wearing now a frock coat buttoned up, and shabby canvas trousers, crumpled into creases at the bottom. And his shirt had not been ironed and he had somehow all over a look of not being fresh. He was very thin, with big eyes, long thin fingers and a swarthy bearded face, and all the same he was handsome. With the Schumanns he was like one of the family, and in their house felt he was at home. And the room in which he lived when he was there had for years been called Sasha's room. Standing on the steps he saw Nadia, and went up to her. "It's nice here," he said. "Of course it's nice, you ought to stay here till the autumn." "Yes, I expect it will come to that. I dare say I shall stay with you till September." He laughed for no reason, and sat down beside her. "I'm sitting gazing at mother," said Nadia. "She looks so young from here. My mother has her weaknesses, of course," she added, after a pause, "but still she is an exceptional woman." "Yes, she is very nice," Sasha agreed. "Your mother, in her own way of course, is a very good and sweet woman, but, how shall I say? I went early this morning into your kitchen and there I found 4 servants sleeping on the floor, no bedsteads, and rags for bedding, stench, bugs, beetles. It is just as it was 20 years ago. No change at all. Well, Granny, God bless her, what else can you expect of Granny? But your mother speaks French, you know, and acts in private theatricals. One would think she might understand." As Sasha talked, he used to stretch out 2 long wasted fingers before the listener's face. "It all seems somehow strange to me here, now I am out of the habit of it," he went on. "There is no making it out. Nobody ever does anything. Your mother spends the whole day walking about like a duchess, Granny does nothing either, nor you either. And your Andrei Andreich never does anything either." Nadia had heard this the year before and, she fancied, the year before that too, and she knew that Sasha could not make any other criticism, and in old days this had amused her. But now for some reason she felt annoyed. "That's all stale, and I have been sick of it for ages," she said and got up. "You should think of something a little newer." He laughed and got up too, and they went together toward the house. She, tall, handsome, and well-made, beside him looked very healthy and smartly dressed. She was conscious of this and felt sorry for him and for some reason awkward. "And you say a great deal you should not," she said. "You've just been talking about my Andrei, but you see you don't know him." "My Andrei. Bother him, your Andrei. I am sorry for your youth." They were already sitting down to supper as the young people went into the dining room. The grandmother, or granny as she was called in the household, a very stout, plain old lady with bushy eyebrows and a little mustache, was talking loudly. And from her voice and manner of speaking it could be seen that she was the person of most importance in the house. She owned rows of shops in the market, and the old-fashioned house with columns and the garden, yet she prayed every morning that God might save her from ruin and shed tears as she did so. Her daughter-in-law, Nadia's mother, Nina Ivanovna, a fair-haired woman tightly laced in, with a pince-nez, and diamonds on every finger, Father Andrei, a lean, toothless old man whose face always looked as though he were just going to say something amusing, and his son, Andrei Andreich, a stout and handsome young man with curly hair looking like an artist or an actor, were all talking of hypnotism. "You will get well in a week here," said Granny, addressing Sasha. "Only you must eat more." "What do you look like?" she sighed. "You are really dreadful. You are a regular prodigal son, that is what you are." "After wasting his father's substance in riotous living," said Father Andrei slowly, with laughing eyes, "he fed with senseless beasts." "I like my dad," said Andrei Andreich, touching his father on the shoulder. "He is a splendid old fellow, a dear old fellow." Everyone was silent for a space. Sasha suddenly burst out laughing and put his dinner napkin to his mouth. "So you believe in hypnotism?" said Father Andrei to Nina Ivanovna. "I cannot, of course, assert that I believe," answered Nina Ivanovna, assuming a very serious, even severe, expression. "But I must own that there is much that is mysterious and incomprehensible in nature. I quite agree with you, though I must add that religion distinctly curtails for us the domain of the mysterious." A big and very fat turkey was served. Father Andrei and Nina Ivanovna went on with their conversation. Nina Ivanovna's diamonds glittered on her fingers, then tears began to glitter in her eyes. She grew excited. "Though I cannot venture to argue with you," she said, "you must admit there are so many insoluble riddles in life." "Not one, I assure you." After supper Andrei Andreich played the fiddle and Nina Ivanovna accompanied him on the piano. 10 years before he had taken his degree at the university in the Faculty of Arts, but had never held any post, had no definite work, and only from time to time took part in concerts for charitable objects. And in the town he was regarded as a musician. Andrei Andreich played, they all listened in silence. The samovar was boiling quietly on the table and no one but Sasha was drinking tea. Then when it struck 12 a violin string suddenly broke, everyone laughed, bustled about, and began saying goodbye. After seeing her fiancé out, Nadia went upstairs where she and her mother had their rooms. The lower story was occupied by the grandmother. They began putting the lights out below in the dining room, while Sasha still sat on drinking tea. He always spent a long time over tea in the Moscow style, drinking as much as 7 glasses at a time. For a long time after Nadia had undressed and gone to bed she could hear the servants clearing away downstairs and Granny talking angrily. At last everything was hushed, and nothing could be heard but Sasha from time to time coughing on a bass note in his room below. Chapter 2. When Nadia woke up it must have been 2 o'clock, it was beginning to get light. A watchman was tapping somewhere far away. She was not sleepy, and her bed felt very soft and uncomfortable. Nadia sat up in her bed and fell to thinking as she had done every night in May. Her thoughts were the same as they had been the night before, useless, persistent thoughts, always alike, of how Andrei Andreich had begun courting her and had made her an offer. How she had accepted him and then little by little had come to appreciate the kindly, intelligent man. But for some reason now when there was hardly a month left before the wedding, she began to feel dread and uneasiness as though something vague and oppressive were before her. Tick-tock, tick-tock, the watchman tapped lazily. Tick-tock. Through the big old-fashioned window she could see the garden and at a little distance bushes of lilac in full flower, drowsy and lifeless from the cold. And the thick white mist was floating softly up to the lilac, trying to cover it. Drowsy rooks were cawing in the faraway trees. My God, why is my heart so heavy? Perhaps every girl felt the same before her wedding. There was no knowing. Or was it Sasha's influence? But for several years past Sasha had been repeating the same thing, like a copybook, and when he talked he seemed naive and queer. But why was it she could not get Sasha out of her head? Why was it? The watchman left off tapping for a long while. The birds were twittering under the windows and the mist had disappeared from the garden. Everything was lighted up by the spring sunshine as by a smile. Soon the whole garden, warm and caressed by the sun, returned to life, and dewdrops like diamonds glittered on the leaves and the old neglected garden on that morning looked young and gaily decked. Granny was already awake. Sasha's husky cough began. Nadia could hear them below, setting the samovar and moving the chairs. The hours passed slowly. Nadia had been up and walking about the garden for a long while and still the morning dragged on. At last Nina Ivanovna appeared with a tear-stained face, carrying a glass of mineral water. She was interested in spiritualism and homeopathy, read a great deal, was fond of talking of the doubts to which she was subject. And to Nadia it seemed as though there were a deep mysterious significance in all that. Now Nadia kissed her mother and walked beside her. "What have you been crying about, mother?" she asked. "Last night I was reading a story in which there is an old man and his daughter. The old man is in some office and his chief falls in love with his daughter. I have not finished it, but there was a passage which made it hard to keep from tears," said Nina Ivanovna, and she sipped at her glass. "I thought of it this morning and shed tears again. I have been so depressed all these days," said Nadia after a pause. "Why is it I don't sleep at night?" "I don't know, dear. When I can't sleep I shut my eyes very tightly, like this, and picture to myself Anna Karenina moving about and talking, or something historical from the ancient world." Nadia felt that her mother did not understand her and was incapable of understanding. She felt this for the first time in her life, and it positively frightened her and made her want to hide herself, and she went away to her own room. At 2 o'clock they sat down to dinner. It was Wednesday, a fast day, and so vegetable soup and bream with boiled grain were set before Granny. To tease Granny, Sasha ate his meat soup as well as the vegetable soup. He was making jokes all through dinner time, but his jests were labored and invariably with a moral bearing. And the effect was not at all amusing when before making some witty remark he raised his very long, thin, deathly-looking fingers. And when one remembered that he was very ill and would probably not be much longer in this world, one felt sorry for him and ready to weep. After dinner Granny went off to her own room to lie down. Nina Ivanovna played on the piano for a little, and then she too went away. "Oh, dear Nadia," Sasha began his usual afternoon conversation, "if only you would listen to me. If only you would." She was sitting far back in an old-fashioned armchair, with her eyes shut, while he paced slowly about the room from corner to corner. "If only you would go to the university," he said. "Only enlightened and holy people are interesting, it's only they who are wanted. The more of such people there are, the sooner the kingdom of God will come on earth. Of your town then not one stone will be left, everything will be blown up from the foundations, everything will be changed as though by magic. And then there will be immense, magnificent houses here, wonderful gardens, marvelous fountains, remarkable people. But that's not what matters most. What matters most is that the crowd, in our sense of the word, in the sense in which it exists now, that evil will not exist then. Because every man will believe and every man will know what he is living for and no one will seek moral support in the crowd. Dear Nadia, darling girl, go away. Show them all that you are sick of this stagnant, gray, sinful life. Prove it to yourself at least." "I can't, Sasha, I'm going to be married." "Oh, nonsense. What's it for?" They went out into the garden and walked up and down a little. "And however that may be, my dear girl, you must think, you must realize how unclean, how immoral this idle life of yours is," Sasha went on. "Do understand that if, for instance, you and your mother and your grandmother do nothing, it means that someone else is working for you, you are eating up someone else's life, and is that clean? Isn't it filthy? Nadia wanted to say, yes, that is true, she wanted to say that she understood, but tears came into her eyes, her spirits drooped, and shrinking into herself she went off to her room. Towards evening Andrei Andreitch arrived and as usual played the fiddle for a long time. He was not given to much talk as a rule, and was fond of the fiddle, perhaps because one could be silent while playing. At 11 o'clock when he was about to go home and had put on his greatcoat, he embraced Nadia and began greedily kissing her face, her shoulders, and her hands. "My dear, my sweet, my charmer," he muttered. "Oh, how happy I am! I am beside myself with rapture." And it seemed to her as though she had heard that long, long ago, or had read it somewhere, in some old tattered novel thrown away long ago. In the dining room Sasha was sitting at the table drinking tea with the saucer poised on his 5 long fingers, Granny was laying out patience, Nina Ivanovna was reading. The flame crackled in the icon lamp and everything, it seemed, was quiet and going well. Nadia said good night, went upstairs to her room, got into bed and fell asleep at once. But just as on the night before, almost before it was light, she woke up. She was not sleepy, there was an uneasy, oppressive feeling in her heart. She sat up with her head on her knees and thought of her fiancé and her marriage. She for some reason remembered that her mother had not loved her father and now had nothing and lived in complete dependence on her mother-in-law, Granny. And however much Nadia pondered she could not imagine why she had hitherto seen in her mother something special and exceptional, how it was she had not noticed that she was a simple, ordinary, unhappy woman. And Sasha downstairs was not asleep, she could hear him coughing. He is a queer, naive man, thought Nadia, and in all his dreams, in all those marvelous gardens and wonderful fountains one felt there was something absurd. But for some reason in his naivete, in this very absurdity there was something so beautiful that as soon as she thought of the possibility of going to the university, it sent a cold thrill through her heart and her bosom and flooded them with joy and rapture. "But better not think," she whispered. "I must not think of it." Tick-tock, tapped the watchman somewhere far away. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Chapter 3. In the middle of June Sasha suddenly felt bored and made up his mind to return to Moscow. "I can't exist in this town," he said gloomily. "No water supply, no drains. It disgusts me to eat at dinner, the filth in the kitchen is incredible. Wait a little, prodigal son." Granny tried to persuade him, speaking for some reason in a whisper, "The wedding is to be on the 7th. I don't want to. You meant to stay with us until September. But now, you see, I don't want to. I must get to work." The summer was grey and cold, the trees were wet, everything in the garden looked dejected and uninviting, it certainly did make one long to get to work. The sound of unfamiliar women's voices was heard downstairs and upstairs, there was the rattle of a sewing machine in Granny's room, they were working hard at the trousseau. Of fur coats alone, 6 were provided for Nadia, and the cheapest of them, in Granny's words, had cost 300 rubles. The fuss irritated Sasha. He stayed in his own room and was cross, but everyone persuaded him to remain, and he promised not to go before the 1st of July. Time passed quickly. Honesty. Peter's Day Andrei Andreitch went with Nadia after dinner to Moscow Street to look once more at the house which had been taken and made ready for the young couple some time before. It was a house of 2 stories, but so far only the upper floor had been furnished. There was in the hall a shining floor painted and parqueted, there were Viennese chairs, a piano, a violin stand. There was a smell of paint. On the wall hung a big oil painting in a gold frame, a naked lady and beside her a purple vase with a broken handle. "An exquisite picture," said Andrei Andreitch, and he gave a respectful sigh. "It's the work of the artist Shizmachevsky." Then there was the drawing room with the round table, and a sofa and easy chairs upholstered in bright blue. Above the sofa was a big photograph of Father André wearing a priest's velvet cap and decorations. Then they went into the dining room in which there was a sideboard, then into the bedroom. Here in the half-dusk stood two bedsteads side by side. And it looked as though the bedroom had been decorated with the idea that it would always be very agreeable there and could not possibly be anything else. Andrei Andreitch led Nadia about the rooms, all the while keeping his arm round her waist, and she felt weak and conscience-stricken. She hated all the rooms, the beds, the easy chairs. She was nauseated by the naked lady. It was clear to her now that she had ceased to love Andrei Andreitch or perhaps had never loved him at all. But how to say this and to whom to say it and with what object she did not understand, and could not understand, though she was thinking about it all day and all night. He held her round the waist, talked so affectionately, so modestly, was so happy, walking about this house of his. While she saw nothing in it all but vulgarity, stupid, naive, unbearable vulgarity, and his arm round her waist felt as hard and cold as an iron hoop. And every minute she was on the point of running away, bursting into sobs, throwing herself out of a window. Andrei Andreitch led her into the bathroom and here he touched a tap fixed in the wall and at once water flowed. "What do you say to that?" he said, and laughed. "I had a tank holding 200 gallons put in the loft, and so now we shall have water." They walked across the yard and went out into the street and took a cab. Thick clouds of dust were blowing, and it seemed as though it were just going to rain. "You are not cold," said Andrei Andreitch, screwing up his eyes at the dust. She did not answer. "Yesterday, you remember, Sasha blamed me for doing nothing," he said, after a brief silence. "Well, he is right, absolutely right. I do nothing and can do nothing. My precious, why is it? Why is it that the very thought that I may some day fix a cockade on my cap and go into the government service is so hateful to me? Why do I feel so uncomfortable when I see a lawyer or a Latin master or a member of the Zemstvo? Oh Mother Russia! Oh Mother Russia! What a burden of idle and useless people you still carry! How many like me are upon you, long-suffering mother?" And from the fact that he did nothing he drew generalizations, seeing in it a sign of the times. "When we are married let us go together into the country, my precious, there we will work. We will buy ourselves a little piece of land with a garden and a river, we will labor and watch life. Oh, how splendid that will be!" He took off his hat, and his hair floated in the wind, while she listened to him and thought, "Good God, I wish I were home." When they were quite near the house they overtook Father Andrei. "Ah, here's Father coming," cried Andrei Andreitch, delighted, and he waved his hat. "I love my dad really," he said as he paid the cabman. "He's a splendid old fellow, a dear old fellow." Nadia went into the house, feeling cross and unwell, thinking that there would be visitors all the evening, that she would have to entertain them, to smile, to listen to the fiddle. To listen to all sorts of nonsense, and to talk of nothing but the wedding. Granny, dignified, gorgeous in her silk dress, and haughty as she always seemed before visitors, was sitting before the samovar. Father Andrei came in with his sly smile. "I have the pleasure and blessed consolation of seeing you in health," he said to Granny, and it was hard to tell whether he was joking or speaking seriously. Chapter 4. The wind was beating on the window and on the roof, there was a whistling sound, and in the stove the house spirit was plaintively and sullenly droning his song. It was past midnight. Everyone in the house had gone to bed, but no one was asleep, and it seemed all the while to Nadia as though they were playing the fiddle below. There was a sharp bang. A shutter must have been torn off. A minute later Nina Ivanovna came in her nightgown, with a candle. "What was the bang, Nadia?" she asked. Her mother, with her hair in a single plait and a timid smile on her face, looked older, plainer, smaller on that stormy night. Nadia remembered that quite a little time ago she had thought her mother an exceptional woman and had listened with pride to the things she said. And now she could not remember those things, everything that came into her mind was so feeble and useless. In the stove was the sound of several bass voices in chorus, and she even heard "Oh oh oh my God." Nadia sat on her bed, and suddenly she clutched at her hair and burst into sobs. "Mother, mother, my own," she said. "If only you knew what is happening to me. I beg you, I beseech you, let me go away. I beseech you." "Where?" asked Nina Ivanovna, not understanding, and she sat down on the bedstead. "Go where?" For a long while Nadia cried and could not utter a word. "Let me go away from the town," she said at last. "There must not and will not be a wedding, understand that. I don't love that man. I can't even speak about him. No, my own, no." Nina Ivanovna said quickly, terribly alarmed. "Calm yourself, it's just because you are in low spirits. It will pass, it often happens. Most likely you have had a tiff with Andrei, but lovers' quarrels always end in kisses." "Oh, go away, mother, oh, go away," sobbed Nadia. "Yes," said Nina Ivanovna after a pause, "it's not long since you were a baby, a little girl, and now you are engaged to be married. In nature there is a continual transmutation of substances. Before you know where you are you will be a mother yourself and an old woman, and will have as rebellious a daughter as I have. My darling, my sweet, you are clever, you know, you are unhappy," said Nadia. "You are very unhappy. Why do you say such very dull, commonplace things? For God's sake, why?" Nina Ivanovna tried to say something, but could not utter a word. She gave a sob and went away to her own room. The bass voices began droning in the stove again, and Nadia felt suddenly frightened. She jumped out of bed and went quickly to her mother. Nina Ivanovna, with tear-stained face, was lying in bed wrapped in a pale blue quilt and holding a book in her hands. "Mother, listen to me," said Nadia. "I implore you, do understand. If you would only understand how petty and degrading our life is. My eyes have been opened, and I see it all now. And what is your Andrei Andreitch? Why, he is not intelligent, mother. Merciful heavens, do understand, mother, he is stupid." Nina Ivanovna abruptly sat up. "You and your grandmother torment me," she said with a sob. "I want to live." "To live," she repeated, and twice she beat her little fist upon her bosom. "Let me be free. I am still young, I want to live, and you have made me an old woman between you." She broke into bitter tears, lay down and curled up under the quilt, and looked so small, so pitiful, so foolish. Nadia went to her room, dressed, and sitting at the window fell to waiting for the morning. She sat all night thinking, while someone seemed to be tapping on the shutters and whistling in the yard. In the morning Granny complained that the wind had blown down all the apples in the garden, and broken down an old plum tree. It was grey, murky, cheerless, dark enough for candles. Everyone complained of the cold, and the rain lashed on the windows. After tea Nadia went into Sasha's room and without saying a word knelt down before an armchair in the corner and hid her face in her hands. "What is it?" asked Sasha. "I can't," she said. "How I could go on living here before, I can't understand, I can't conceive. I despise the man I am engaged to, I despise myself, I despise all this idle, senseless existence." "Well, well," said Sasha, not yet grasping what was meant. "That's all right, that's good. I am sick of this life," Nadia went on. "I can't endure another day here. Tomorrow I am going away. Take me with you for God's sake." For a minute Sasha looked at her in astonishment, at last he understood and was delighted as a child. He waved his arms and began pattering with his slippers as though he were dancing with delight. "Splendid," he said, rubbing his hands. "My goodness, how fine that is." And she stared at him without blinking, with adoring eyes, as though spellbound, expecting every minute that he would say something important, something infinitely significant. He had told her nothing yet, but already it seemed to her that something new and great was opening before her which she had not known till then, and already she gazed at him full of expectation. Ready to face anything, even death. "I am going tomorrow," he said after a moment's thought. "You come to the station to see me off. I'll take your things in my portmanteau, and I'll get your ticket, and when the third bell rings you get into the carriage, and we'll go off. You'll see me as far as Moscow and then go on to Petersburg alone. Have you a passport?" "Yes." "I can promise you, you won't regret it," said Sasha, with conviction. "You will go, you will study, and then go where fate takes you. When you turn your life upside down everything will be changed. The great thing is to turn your life upside down, and all the rest is unimportant. And so we will set off tomorrow?" "Oh yes, for God's sake." It seemed to Nadia that she was very much excited, that her heart was heavier than ever before, that she would spend all the time till she went away in misery in agonizing thought. But she had hardly gone upstairs and lain down on her bed when she fell asleep at once, with traces of tears and a smile on her face, and slept soundly till evening. Chapter 5. A cab had been sent for. Nadia in her hat and overcoat went upstairs to take one more look at her mother, at all her belongings. She stood in her own room beside her still warm bed, looked about her, then went slowly into her mother. Nina Ivanovna was asleep, it was quite still in her room. Nadia kissed her mother, smoothed her hair, stood still for a couple of minutes, then walked slowly downstairs. It was raining heavily. The cabman with the hood pulled down was standing at the entrance, drenched with rain. "There is not room for you, Nadia," said Granny, as the servants began putting in the luggage. "What an idea to see him off in such weather. You had better stop at home. Goodness, how it rains." Nadia tried to say something, but could not. Then Sasha helped Nadia in and covered her feet with a rug. Then he sat down beside her. "Good luck to you. God bless you." Granny cried from the steps. "Mind you write to us from Moscow, Sasha." "Right. Goodbye, Granny. The Queen of Heaven keep you." "Oh, what weather," said Sasha. It was only now that Nadia began to cry. Now it was clear to her that she certainly was going, which she had not really believed when she was saying goodbye to Granny, and when she was looking at her mother. Goodbye, town. And she suddenly thought of it all, Andrei, and his father and the new house and the naked lady with the vase. And it all no longer frightened her, nor weighed upon her, but was naive and trivial and continually retreated further away. And when they got into the railway carriage and the train began to move, all that past which had been so big and serious shrank up into something tiny. And a vast wide future which till then had scarcely been noticed began unfolding before her. The rain pattered on the carriage windows, nothing could be seen but the green fields, telegraph posts with birds sitting on the wires flitted by, and joy made her hold her breath. She thought that she was going to freedom, going to study, and this was just like what used, ages ago, to be called going off to be a free Cossack. She laughed and cried and prayed all at once. "It's all right," said Sasha, smiling. "It's all right." Chapter 6. Autumn had passed and winter, too, had gone. Nadia had begun to be very homesick and thought every day of her mother and her grandmother. She thought of Sasha too. The letters that came from home were kind and gentle, and it seemed as though everything by now were forgiven and forgotten. In May after the examinations she set off for home in good health and high spirits, and stopped on the way at Moscow to see Sasha. He was just the same as the year before, with the same beard and unkempt hair, with the same large beautiful eyes, and he still wore the same coat and canvas trousers. But he looked unwell and worried, he seemed both older and thinner, and kept coughing, and for some reason he struck Nadia as grey and provincial. "My God, Nadia has come," he said, and laughed gaily. "My darling girl." They sat in the printing room, which was full of tobacco smoke, and smelt strongly, stiflingly of Indian ink and paint. Then they went to his room, which also smelt of tobacco and was full of the traces of spitting. Near a cold samovar stood a broken plate with dark paper on it, and there were masses of dead flies on the table and on the floor. And everything showed that Sasha ordered his personal life in a slovenly way and lived anyhow, with utter contempt for comfort, and if anyone began talking to him of his personal happiness, of his personal life, of affection for him, he would not have understood and would have only laughed. "It is all right, everything has gone well," said Nadia hurriedly. "Mother came to see me in Petersburg in the autumn. She said that Granny is not angry, and only keeps going into my room and making the sign of the cross over the walls." Sasha looked cheerful, but he kept coughing, and talked in a cracked voice, and Nadia kept looking at him, unable to decide whether he really were seriously ill or whether it were only her fancy. "Dear Sasha," she said, "you are ill." "No, it's nothing, I am ill, but not very." "Oh, dear," cried Nadia, in agitation. "Why don't you go to a doctor? Why don't you take care of your health?" "My dear, darling Sasha," she said, and tears gushed from her eyes, and for some reason there rose before her imagination Andrei Andreitch and the naked lady with the vase. And all her past which seemed now as far away as her childhood. And she began crying because Sasha no longer seemed to her so novel, so cultured, and so interesting as the year before. "Dear Sasha, you are very, very ill. I would do anything to make you not so pale and thin. I am so indebted to you. You can't imagine how much you have done for me, my good Sasha. In reality you are now the person nearest and dearest to me." They sat on and talked, and now, after Nadia had spent a winter in Petersburg, Sasha, his works, his smile, his whole figure had for her a suggestion of something out of date, old-fashioned. Done with long ago and perhaps already dead and buried. "I am going down the Volga the day after tomorrow," said Sasha, "and then to drink kumiss. I mean to drink kumiss. A friend and his wife are going with me. His wife is a wonderful woman. I am always at her, trying to persuade her to go to the university. I want her to turn her life upside down." After having talked they drove to the station. Sasha got her tea and apples. And when the train began moving and he waved his handkerchief at her, smiling, it could be seen even from his legs that he was very ill and would not live long. Nadia reached her native town at midday. As she drove home from the station the streets struck her as very wide and the houses very small and squat. There were no people about, she met no one but the German piano tuner in a rusty greatcoat. And all the houses looked as though they were covered with dust. Granny, who seemed to have grown quite old, but was as fat and plain as ever, flung her arms round Nadia and cried for a long time with her face on Nadia's shoulder, unable to tear herself away. Nina Ivanovna looked much older and plainer and seemed shriveled up, but was still tightly laced, and still had diamonds flashing on her fingers. "My darling," she said, trembling all over, "my darling." Then they sat down and cried without speaking. It was evident that both mother and grandmother realized that the past was lost and gone, never to return. They had now no position in society, no prestige as before, no right to invite visitors. So it is when in the midst of an easy careless life the police suddenly burst in at night and made a search. And it turns out that the head of the family has embezzled money or committed forgery, and goodbye then to the easy careless life forever. Nadia went upstairs and saw the same bed, the same windows with naive white curtains, and outside the windows the same garden, gay and noisy, bathed in sunshine. She touched the table, sat down and sank into thought. And she had a good dinner and drank tea with delicious rich cream. But something was missing. There was a sense of emptiness in the rooms and the ceilings were so low. In the evening she went to bed, covered herself up and for some reason it seemed to her to be funny lying in this snug, very soft bed. Nina Ivanovna came in for a minute. She sat down as people who feel guilty sit down, timidly, and looking about her. "Well, tell me, Nadia," she inquired after a brief pause, "are you contented?" "Quite contented." Yes, mother. Nina Ivanovna got up, made the sign of the cross over Nadia and the windows. I have become religious, as you see, she said. You know I am studying philosophy now, and I am always thinking and thinking. And many things have become as clear as daylight to me. It seems to me that what is above all necessary is that life should pass as it were through a prism. Tell me, mother, how is Granny in health? She seems all right. When you went away that time with Sasha and the telegram came from you, Granny fell on the floor as she read it. For 3 days she lay without moving. After that she was always praying and crying. But now she is all right again. She got up and walked about the room. Tick-tock, tapped the watchman. Tick-tock, tick-tock. What is above all necessary is that life should pass as it were through a prism, she said. In other words, that life in consciousness should be analyzed into its simplest elements as into the 7 primary colors, and each element must be studied separately. What Nina Ivanovna said further, and when she went away, Nadia did not hear, as she quickly fell asleep. May passed, June came. Nadia had grown used to being at home. Granny busied herself about the samovar, heaving deep sighs. Nina Ivanovna talked in the evenings about her philosophy. She still lived in the house like a poor relation, and had to go to Granny for every farthing. There were lots of flies in the house, and the ceiling seemed to become lower and lower. Granny and Nina Ivanovna did not go out in the streets for fear of meeting Father Andrei and Andrei Andreich. Nadia walked about the garden and the streets, looked at the grey fences, and it seemed to her that everything in the town had grown old, was out of date and was only waiting either for the end or for the beginning of something young and fresh. Oh, if only that new, bright life would come more quickly, that life in which one will be able to face one's fate boldly and directly, to know that one is right, to be light-hearted and free. And sooner or later such a life will come. The time will come when of Granny's house, where things are so arranged that the 4 servants can only live in one room in filth in the basement, the time will come when of that house not a trace will remain, and it will be forgotten. No one will remember it. And Nadia's only entertainment was from the boys next door. When she walked about the garden they knocked on the fence and shouted in mockery, "Betrothed! Betrothed!" A letter from Sasha arrived from Saratov. In his gay dancing handwriting he told them that his journey on the Volga had been a complete success, but that he had been taken rather ill in Saratov, had lost his voice, and had been for the last fortnight in the hospital. She knew what that meant, and she was overwhelmed with a foreboding that was like a conviction. And it vexed her that this foreboding and the thought of Sasha did not distress her so much as before. She had a passionate desire for life, longed to be in Petersburg, and her friendship with Sasha seemed now sweet but something far, far away. She did not sleep all night, and in the morning sat at the window, listening. And she did in fact hear voices below. Granny, greatly agitated, was asking questions rapidly. Then someone began crying. When Nadia went downstairs Granny was standing in the corner, praying before the icon, and her face was tearful. A telegram lay on the table. For some time Nadia walked up and down the room, listening to Granny's weeping, then she picked up the telegram and read it. It announced that the previous morning Alexander Timofeich, or more simply, Sasha, had died at Saratov of consumption. Granny and Nina Ivanovna went to the church to order a memorial service, while Nadia went on walking about the rooms and thinking. She recognized clearly that her life had been turned upside down as Sasha wished, that here she was, alien, isolated, useless, and that everything here was useless to her. That all the past had been torn away from her and vanished as though it had been burnt up and the ashes scattered to the winds. She went into Sasha's room and stood there for a while. "Goodbye, dear Sasha," she thought, and before her mind rose the vista of a new, wide, spacious life, and that life, still obscure and full of mysteries, beckoned her and attracted her. She went upstairs to her own room to pack, and next morning said goodbye to her family, and full of life and high spirits left the town, as she supposed forever.